Okay, Spatial Shark back just before the Thanksgiving break with a few more videos for Unit 4, Political Organization of Space. This quick video is going to be a little bit shorter, maybe, perhaps. We'll see how quickly I can get through this. But we're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And basically, this was an agreement in recent times, really since the 1980s, where the member states of the UN have moved to set a uniform, regular amount of territorial water and exclusive economic zones that each UN member state can have as an extension of their sovereignty out off of the land and into the water surrounding their country. Of course, this doesn't apply to landlocked states. And really what this started with was countries were all claiming different amounts of territory into the water. Back in the European medieval period, it was even as far as you could shoot a cannonball was how far you could claim out into the water. Some countries were claiming only 3 miles. Some countries were claiming hundreds of miles. President Truman once claimed that the continental shelf was U.S. territory extending out off the Atlantic seaboard. Continental shelf is, of course, the seabed floor. So there was certainly a need for some sort of regularity. So basically, UNCLOS provides for several key things. And first is the idea of territorial water or territorial seas. And this is a 12-mile zone. Within that 12 miles, your country has total sovereignty. You can enforce your laws. Any type of activity that's happening in that territorial sea, you have total, complete control over what's going on. There is a contiguous zone that is also 12 miles that touches that original 12. So 24 miles. So if you're chasing a boat that's suspected of running drugs or something like that, you can extend your 12 miles out into the 24 total miles. So two sets of 12. They call it the contiguous zone. Contiguous in this sense, of course, means that the two are touching. So then you have an exclusive economic zone. Now, this does not allow sovereignty. What it does provide is the ability to regulate and to kind of monitor the economic activities of other states within your EEZ. So, for example, you might remember a couple of years ago, there was a big BP oil spill disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. So that was within the EEZ of the United States. So when BP had that disaster, the U.S. government successfully forced them to pay and to compensate for all of those damages, the cleanup and the reparations and all that. So it ended up being something like $20 billion. The U.S. taxpayer didn't have to pay that. That was paid for by BP, British Petroleum. So these basic processes of the UNCLOS boundary allow states to have their power projected out into the water. If two littoral states, and the word literal in this sense means coastal, they have access to the water there. If two littoral states have less water, say between Spain and Morocco, or say between Indonesia and Malaysia and the Strait of Malacca, or between say Somalia and Yemen in the Gulf of Aden, if they don't have enough water, there's what we call the median line principle, and that basically just means what you think it means. You draw a line halfway in between, and that's the division. But of course, there are a lot of places in the world where people don't want to agree to those easy kinds of splits. The Malvinas, for example, the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. Argentina claims that those are organically part of Argentina, that they should be Argentinian territory. They've been British since the 1700s. They actually fought a war in the 1980s where Argentina occupied the islands. The British went down there and basically said, no, you're not taking away this territory. This is British territory, and the conflict erupted. Another big one, huge, it's in the news this week, the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. This is a place where Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Brunei all have claims out into the South China Sea. In fact, they won't refer to it as the South China Sea because if you call it the South China Sea, it's almost like you're implying that, hey, this is inherently Chinese water. China claims that they have a treaty going back to the 1800s that supersedes this modern UNCLOS agreement. They say, no, 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 we've got a treaty older. It takes precedence. It takes priority. We claim the whole body of water and the islands that are in it. And so there's islands there, the Paracel Islands. There's one that's called Mischief Reef, but the Spratly Islands especially, tremendous oil deposits. All of the countries would love to access that oil. China has begun militarizing these islands, building airstrips on them, stationing warships near them, putting missile batteries on them, and basically saying, no, 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 this is all going to be Chinese territory. Therefore, we have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone around all of these islands. We have 12-mile territorial water around these islands. So since it's disputed, the United States, being the biggest naval power in the world, likes to flex its muscles once in a while just to kind of challenge the Chinese assertion that these are indeed Chinese territory. So what the United States Navy will do is they will deliberately sail destroyers and guided missile cruisers and, literal combat ships and things like that. They'll just sail by the islands and be like, hey, y'all, and just basically say to the Chinese, look, here we are. We're deliberately sailing within 12 miles because we don't recognize your legitimacy over this water. And it just really irritates the Chinese that the United States Navy will sail through there. And China will make all these statements like, oh, this is deliberately provocative and it's not helping to make the tensions, higher or whatever. And the United States Navy says, well, tough, because these are not really your islands anyway. So we're just going to keep on doing it. So basically, here's the cool little chart that shows you what we mean. When you draw the line along your coastline, and this is something you see a lot in the United States, this is where we have our intracoastal waterway. And you guys know this, of course, in Boca and Delray and Deerfield, up and down the coastline. Some of you may have been out on boats in Lake Boca. Basically, you're in the intracoastal, not inter. Inter means between, intra means within. This is internal water. It's American water. And nobody disputes that because it's inside the coastline. When you go outside the coastline, then you get into the territorial sea. This is why on a cruise ship, a lot of times you'll see that the casino can't be open because you have to get out into international water before that happens. So inside the territorial water, you're under the sovereignty of the state that you are, kind of going along the coastline. So when you guys go into port on your cruise, once you get inside the territorial water, you're under the jurisdiction of that state. So remember I told you there's the contiguous zone. That basically just means it's a little bit extra in case you're actively pursuing some sort of criminal activity. But then you get out into the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and once you're out in there, you're in international water. And the only thing that a state can do here, again, is regulate, like, for example, fishing or drilling for oil. Nigeria, for example, if you drill for oil off the coast of Nigeria, you have to pay them a royalty fee, which basically amounts to about 85% of whatever the value of the oil that you drill. And so this is a huge cash influx for Nigeria. And people would say, well, why would you give them 85%? That's almost not worth it. Think about if you get tens of billions of dollars worth of oil. Yeah, you have to give 85% of it to Nigeria because after all, it's off their coastline. It's in their EEZ. It's their oil. But you're still making 15% of those billions of dollars. That's still a lot of money. And again, you're paying them out of the profits. You're not paying them out of the basic cost. So it's still a lucrative thing to be able to drill in these areas that have tremendous amounts of oil. Here's another good example. This is Australia. And of course, their territorial sea is the light blue color, and their exclusive economic zone, of course, is in the green color. But remember, Australia owns a lot of these small little islands, so therefore they also get an exclusive economic zone around those islands. And this is why in the South China Sea, China wants all these Spratly Islands, because if you can extend your sovereignty out to the islands, then you can extend your exclusive economic zone, and then all of that resource, oil deposits, for example, would become Chinese. So this is a good example showing how that EEZ and how the territorial water works. So I wanted to show you a map of this area of the South China Sea. the part that is in dispute. They sometimes refer to this as the 9-dash line. On this particular map, there are more than 9 dashes, but a lot of times on a map, you'll see 9 dashes that surround the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, and again, China, all of this, it looks like a tongue sticking down. China claims all of that. Of course, if you follow the UNCLOS procedure, this would all be Vietnamese, this would be Malaysian, this would be Indonesian, this would be Filipino. All of these other areas would be, under the control of different countries. And by the way, the United States, why are we so involved in this as well? Don't forget, the Philippines was U.S. territory until 1947. We took the Philippines away from Spain in the War of 1898. They became independent after World War II. So the United States still has a vested interest in what's going on in this part of the world. And let's be honest, the Filipinos, the Malaysians, the Vietnamese, they're not able to stand up to the military power of, the People's Republic of China. But we can. Remember, we have more aircraft carriers than every other country in the world combined. So, if you really, really want to push around in the water, you're going to have to deal with the U.S. Navy because we rule the waves. So this is, again, a hot spot in the world. It's definitely in the news if you pay attention to it. You'll see articles almost every other week or so about tensions in the Spratly Islands and in the South China Sea. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples and really what's happening in some of these areas. And you got to remember different vocabulary words about, being in the water. When you have a reef, or a sandbar, and you guys, again, a lot of you have been out in the water. A reef is sometimes exposed and sometimes it's not. In other words, the water may cover it at parts of the day at high tide and the water may recede during low tide. When you have an atoll, right, when you start to have an outcropping of the island that sticks up above the water, that's different. So, the reef is generally below the water. The island, of course, sticks up over the water. But when you have that exclusive economic zone and territorial water, you're starting to claim areas around it. And some of these are little uninhabited places. So what China's doing is they go down there and they stick maybe like a cell phone tower. Remember in the old days, the Europeans would put a flag on the ground and say, we claim this for God and country and, the king and the glory and all that. Well, now it's like you're planting a cell phone tower and somehow that makes it your territory. There's another dispute, not in the South China Sea. It's actually in the Sea of Japan, between Japan and Korea. But of course, the Koreans won't call it the Sea of Japan. They call it the East Sea because it's east of Korea. And there's a disagreement between Japan and South Korea over what are known as the Dokdo Islands, 2 tiny little islands that are just seemingly insignificant to everybody else, but it's a really big deal to these countries. And again, this is all because of what are we always fighting about? We're fighting about land. So this is an example of some of these natural formations that are in the South China Sea. But I want to show you what happens when China starts dumping sand and starts artificially creating larger islands and then militarizes them. And this is a picture from the South China Sea. And again, they've built this huge airstrip capable of military aircraft. They have bases now where they can, reside these soldiers and the airmen and the sailors that are involved here. Ships can now come into these man-made artificial harbors and ports. And this is what's happening. This is a real concern for countries like the Philippines and for Vietnam and for Malaysia that China's territorial expansion continues out into the South China Sea. Okay, that'll do it for this little section. We'll come back. We'll talk about electoral geography.